As I pray in my faith, I invite you to pray in yours. Please join me. Dear God, as we come together today, we pray for all of those who are impacted so directly and so many people, not only nationwide but worldwide, by the events of 9/11, 14 years ago this past Friday. And for all of those folks, we remember. For all those folks that are fleeing countries where there's so much war and so much unsettlement in their lives, we just pray for them as they try to get to countries where they can simply live in peace. We pray for all the things that we take for granted: clothing, housing, jobs, transportation, clean water. And we pray for those who don't have those things, and we remember. We thank you for this food that's been prepared for us today, and we pray for those who have no food, and we remember. In your name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Ann. You may be seated. As you get comfortable, I'd ask you to remember the cart bucket on each table, the blue bucket. If someone from each table would pick up that bucket, hold it up high. We're a little behind here today in our giving to cart. I'll remind you, every dollar that goes in there is used to fund Alzheimer's research. And, so please give generously. I'll now call forward Holt Chetwood to welcome our visiting Rotarians and guests.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you have a great Monday. We have one visiting Rotarian today, Netta Beal from Capital Rotary Club. Netta, welcome. And then I know we have a number of visitors. If you have a visitor here with you, if you'll please stand, and we'll pass the microphone and ask you to introduce them.
I'm Adam Jordan. My guest today is Brad Wright. He's an attorney with the Mayor Law Firm.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ed Greenleaf. I have with me two guests today. In true bipartisan fashion, I have with me Heather Smith. Heather is a partner with Southern Strategy Group, a political lobbying firm here in Columbia and in Tallahassee. She's working with the Jeb Bush campaign. And I also have with me Jaleesa Washington. Jaleesa is the state political director for Hillary for America.
I'd like to introduce two guests of our speaker today. Rachel Heister, who flew in from Washington with the speaker today to be with us, and Lear Derrick, who's an attorney here in Columbia.
Good afternoon. Dino Natalie Tempire, visiting Rotarian, training from Fort Jackson. Glad to be here.
So to our visiting Rotarians and guests, welcome one more time. We're glad to have you with us this afternoon. Enjoy the program.
Thank you, Holt. Now looking for Regina Brown to come forward and share this week's Health and Happiness Report.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm finna say, y'all don't sound like y'all healthy today. You're not responding. Okay, so is Mr. Charlie Darlin Lindler in the room? No? Okay, so call him today and wish him a happy 95th birthday. Just come tell him that Regina called him Charlie Darlin. Okay, since you all didn't have anything to give me for health and happiness, I'm going to give you something that's going to make you happy. Okay, so, and my friend Ed, this is not you, okay? I'm just using Ed as a name. Ed was in trouble. He forgot his wedding anniversary. His wife was really angry. She told him tomorrow morning, I expect to find a gift in the driveway that goes from 0 to 200 in 5 seconds, and it better be there. The next morning, Ed got up early and left for work. When his wife woke up, she looked out the window, and sure enough, there was a gift. It was a small box gift wrap in the middle of the driveway. Confused, the wife put on her robe and ran out the driveway, brought the box back on the inside. She opened the box and found a new bathroom scale. Ed has been missing since then. That's what she needs to laugh. Okay, so, how many women here are looking for a husband? Anybody? No? Okay, so, you can tell other women this who are looking for husbands. A store that sells husbands just opened in New York City where women may go to choose a husband. Among the instructions at the entrance is a description of how the store operates. You may visit the store only once. There are 6 floors, and the attributes of the men increase as the shoppers ascend the flights. There is, however, a catch. The shopper may choose a man from a particular floor or choose to go up 1 floor at a time. However, the shopper may not return to the lower floor except, of course, to exit the building. So a woman goes into the husband's store to find a husband. On the first floor, the sign on the door reads, Floor 1. These men have jobs and love the Lord. She gets back in the elevator and proceeds to the 2nd floor. The 2nd floor sign reads, These men have jobs, love the Lord, and love kids. She gets back in the elevator and proceeds to the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor sign reads, These men have jobs, love the Lord, love kids, and are extremely good looking. Wow, she thinks, but feel compelled to keep going. She takes the elevator to the 4th floor, and the sign reads, These men have jobs, love the Lord, love kids, and are drop-dead good looking and help with housework. Oh, mercy, she exclaimed, I can hardly stand it. Still, she goes to the 5th floor. The 5th floor sign reads, These men have jobs, love the Lord, love kids, drop-dead gorgeous, help with housework, and have a strong romantic streak. She is so tempted to stay, but she goes to the 6th floor, and the sign reads, You are a visitor 4 trillion today. And there are no men on this floor. This floor exists only solely as proof that women are impossible to please. Thank you for shopping the husband store and have a great day. So y'all have a good week.
Thank you, Regina. I'd like now for Jones Bowes to come forward. Jones is a longtime Rotarian and current board chairman at Harvest Hope Food Bank.
Thanks, Mark. As Mark said, I'm currently serving as the board chairman of Harvest Hope Food Bank. And Mark asked me to make a couple of announcements related to Harvest Hope. First, I wanted to thank the club for its involvement and support of Harvest Hope. Harvest Hope provides immediate service to those less fortunate in the Midlands and does it in a very efficient manner. 98 cents out of every donated dollar goes to the Harvest Oaks Charitable Mission. And on that note, I'm happy to announce that the club has decided to make a $5,000 grant to Harvest Oaks. The grant is composed of $2,500. The grant is composed of a $2,500 gift from our club and its members, and a matching grant of $2,500 from District 77. Harvest Oaks is very grateful for this generous contribution. Second, Lane Ligon has organized another food packaging project for the club. These food packaging projects by our local businesses and organizations are essential for Harvest Oaks to provide food efficiently to those in need. The next event is this Wednesday, September 16th at 4 p.m. Meeting at Harvest Oaks at the warehouse on Shop Road. Just talk to Lane. Lane said he's looking for 3, 4, 5 more volunteers. And if you're able to come, let Lane know. He's seated over here to the left. Lane will send out an email to everyone that's participating with all the details. Again, thanks so much for the club's support of Harvest Oaks.
Thank you, James. I'll point out the money that we're going to donate to Harvest Oaks, a lot of it, the majority of it is spent on food that we'll actually pack together this Wednesday. And that food is then sent out to an area of our community in critical need. So the majority of the funds will be used for that. We also have some of the money earmarked to provide some much-needed capital equipment for Harvest Oaks. So thank you, Jones. Thank you, Lane, for your leadership. And we look forward to Wednesday, 4 o'clock. Hope to see many of you there. Moving forward here, we have an announcement from our membership chairman, Adam Jordan. Adam's done a great job with membership this year. He's got something he's going to roll out today that is unique and something I've never seen done before. So, Adam.
Thank you, President Mark. As you recall, we are revamping our approach to membership this year, and Mark and the board and Libby Gover have made this a high priority for our club, and our early momentum is strong, and I'm proud to report. We're inducting at least 7 new members in 2 weeks on September 28th, with more in the wings for October. It's great news. But we want to enable even more growth, and we want to help each of you introduce more people to our club. So today, we're rolling out our VIP program. It's occurring as we speak. Libby and her team are handing out our VIP cards. Each of you who are here today will receive a VIP card, and it entitles you to a free lunch for a guest between now and the end of the year. And first, I want to sincerely thank Cal Sewell and his group here. They are doing this for us. They are sponsoring it. It is cost neutral for the club, very generous on their part. And so we really appreciate the partnership with Sewells on this. How does it work? It's very simple. Bring this card with you between now and the end of the year when you bring a guest. And lunch is on us. There is only one catch. This is for non-family member guests only. So if I want to bring my mom when President-elect John Dacus schedules Barry Manilow to sing here, that is not going to be covered. Count on you, John. My mom's excited about the prospects. Quick reminder for everybody, our goal this year as a club is 500 guests, 2 guests per person. That's the goal I hope everyone focuses on. We hope this VIP program is a tool that assists you in meeting this goal. And as Jones was talking about earlier, Columbia Rotary really is changing lives locally and globally. Let's introduce more of our city to what we're doing here. Thank you. If you didn't get one, this is passed around. I'll be at the piano afterwards. Come by and see me. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam and Libby. Many folks worked on this to make it a reality. It's exciting to see the momentum building in our club in terms of membership, and I want to thank you both for your leadership in that area, and for John Johnston as well, past President John Johnston, helping to put on this. So looking forward to all the guests and potential new members down the road. We'll now move into the program. At this time, I'll call forward Bernie Maybank to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. I'm going to give a very gloomy introduction. I think that's the topic that only really can help.
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Now speak in the mic, right?
Can you hear me now? Yeah. I'm going to introduce our guest with gloom, and this subject matter really can only be dealt with gloom. The biggest problem this country faces today is not ISIS, it's not funding for Planned Parenthood or Hillary Clinton's emails, it's the national debt. When I was in college, and that was a few years ago, my economics professor said, well, the deficit's obviously a bad thing, the debt's obviously a bad thing, but we're paying money to ourselves, it's Americans who are buying the debt. Well, the Chinese own about $19 billion of our debt today. The two worst presidents in terms of deficit, the increase in the deficit has been the last two, President Obama and President Bush. And nobody expects President Obama, of course, endured the Great Recession, and the deficit actually rose during that time. And then President Bush fought 2 wars. So nobody expected them to make any dramatic accomplishments their first term. No first-term president is ever going to do that. But in the second term, I think they've both been a disappointment. We haven't heard a word about from President Obama on the debt. And President Bush didn't. He was flirting with Social Security reform, but never really introduced anything. Congress actually tried to deal with it about 30 years ago. The most serious effort to pass a constitutional amendment to cure the debt was about 30 years ago. It failed by a single vote. Senator Fritz Holling cast a deciding vote against it, and he was a big deficit hawk. You don't have, our Constitution doesn't allow the president to have line item veto authority the way every governor does. And so Congress did pass a statute that sort of gave him, the president, a backdoor line item veto. Senator Byrd won a lawsuit against that, and that statute was struck down. And Congress hadn't gone back to it. One would have thought with the deficit at an all-time level, some president would have called for a constitutional amendment. You know, our General Assembly gave charities the ability to do a lottery. You know, charities wanted to do a lottery. Our General Assembly agreed. We passed a constitutional amendment just last year for that. Our General Assembly would give you a lottery, but the U.S. Constitution is not going to give the president a line item veto or even talk about it. Politically, it's tough. Most House members in the U.S. Congress are in a safe seat. The only danger they face is a primary. What Democrat is going to call for entitlement spending reform? How well is that going to look for them in the next primary? What Republican is going to say, we've reached the point, we've simply got to increase taxes to reduce the deficit. That isn't going to play well in the Republican primary either. So we're in a tough spot. You know the presidential candidates, when they talk about the deficit, are not serious if they talk about one of two things. One is, we got to cure the deficit by eliminating fat, waste, and fraud. Discretionary spending in this country is down to a uniquely low level. We can eliminate all discretionary spending and not even hardly touch the debt. The second thing they say is, well, we need to do a new Simpson Bowles. Why do we got to do a new one? Simpson Bowles issued a huge plan. Why don't we just follow it? The bottom line is the deficit's getting much worse. 51% of the people who file income taxes in this country, who file returns, don't pay a penny. They don't pay 1 penny of federal income taxes. 51%. Our General Assembly, by contrast, Brad Wright, our guest today, was Chief of Staff. We cut our general fund 25% during the Great Recession. 25% was cut with no quarreling, no fighting, no finger pointing, no partisanship. They just cut it. Simple as that. Most of y'all didn't even see the difference. That's what we're facing on the debt, and we have a speaker today, Maya MacGuineas, is going to talk about it. She's president of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, as well as head of the campaign to fix the debt, and it's kind of an outgrowth of Simpson Bowles. She regularly appears before Congress and published, and was called an anti-deficit warrior by the Wall Street Journal. Yep.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me if I do that? Is this right, the mic? Okay, well, thank you for the gloomy introduction, which is really fitting to this topic. I like to speak places where there's a speaker following me, some kind of an inspirational speaker, because I depress myself every time. But what I'd like to do today is I'll talk a little bit about our organization and mainly sort of where we are in fiscal issues, maybe where we should be going and where we actually are going. But mainly I'd like to have a conversation. So I'm just going to kind of go quickly and then open it up so we can all talk. I know it's a really engaged and knowledgeable group. Just by ways of background, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, which is like the worstly named organization ever, our acronym is CRFPA. So the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget has been around for 30 years. It is a very bipartisan organization. Our co-chairs are former Congressman Tim Penny, former Governor Mitch Daniels, and who's also former director of OMB under Bush, and Leon Panetta, who was head of OMB and chief of staff. So very, very bipartisan. Our board is made up of all the people who run the budget committees, or the Secretary of Treasury, the Fed, Office of Management and Budget, the Congressional Budget Office. So it is the who's who of budget wonks. I've run it for 10 years. I am just, and I think this is always important to know, but political backgrounds, I'm a diehard political independent. For the Bush and Clinton folks, I'm like that weird undecided voter who won't know who I'm voting for until the very last minute. I'm also the weird voter who votes for whoever will cut my spending and raise my taxes the most, given the issue that I care about, so I'm probably the only person who looks for that. But it's a really interesting maybe not everybody thinks the budget is as interesting as I do. I think it's a really interesting organization that does as much as possible to talk about budget policy, fiscal policy, economic policy, looking at what's going on in Washington, working with policymakers to try to push them to be more responsible, and then trying to find ways to connect issues to the public. A couple of years ago, around Simpson Bowls, does everybody know what Simpson Bowls is? Not necessarily. Simpson Bowls was a very big commission that was set up by President Obama. It was Republicans and Democrats, sitting members of Congress, and outside experts. They came together, and their objective was to find a budget plan that would deal with the pressing fiscal challenges of this country. And nobody had any high hopes for it at all. We've done so many commissions, so many task forces, it rarely does it turn up anything real. And it was a remarkable exceeding of expectations when this commission came out with a plan that would save $4 trillion over 10 years, which was enough not to balance the budget. And we are so far deep in the hole that I think balancing the budget in the immediate future is really probably beyond what we're going to be able to do, unless we have some really positive surprises on the upside. But this plan would have saved $4 trillion. It included all parts of the budget, which basically means there was something for everybody to hate in it, but that also kind of shows that it's credible. When you're talking about how to address fiscal problems, there are no easy solutions. You just mentioned two of the kind of myths out there. We have a big publication of the 16 budget myths to keep an eye on in the presidential campaign, and there will be many more. But there's no magic trick here. We are going to have to look at all parts of the budget. We're going to have to make policy choices that are the opposite of what politicians like to do. They like to come in here and they like to talk about how they're going to give massive tax cuts and create many new government programs. They don't like to talk about how they're going to pay for them. And they don't like to talk about how they're going to actually address the fact that we have deficits that are $500 billion and debt that's at record levels. And that's not going to work. And so Simpson Bowles was sort of the unusual thing to come out of Washington that actually addressed this head on. It made reforms in Social Security, it made reforms in health care, it cut spending and domestic discretionary spending, defense spending and domestic discretionary. It cut out waste and fraud, which is not a huge piece of the budget, but definitely needs to be addressed. It raised revenues, but importantly, it raised them by reforming the tax code, which is, a disaster for so many reasons. Instead of just raising tax rates, it did it in a way, I think, that was really important. First off, it brought Republicans and Democrats together who signed on. You had his liberal member as Senator Dick Durbin, with his conservative member as Tom Coburn, all embracing this plan, which is very unusual. And part of how it did that is it respected kind of the core values of both conservatives and progressives. So when it reformed entitlements, which Democrats care dearly about to generalize, it did so in a way that protected everybody who depended on those programs. So it asked people who needed them less to contribute more, but it protected the benefits for the lowest income people who depend on the programs the most. When it raised revenue, which is something that Republicans, not only do they not want to do, they take steps not to do, it did so, again, in a way that really completely turned the tax code on its head, wiped away the $1.3 trillion of tax breaks that we have per year, lowered rates dramatically, and then found ways to kind of gradually put some of those tax breaks in where they made sense in a way that would both close the deficit, and raise revenues, and help grow the economy. So anyway, Simpson Bowles was an incredibly important moment on fiscal policy because it showed what it would take to actually fix the problem, both from a policy perspective and a political perspective. Out of that came this other organization called the Campaign to Fix the Debt. And the campaign has been a really interesting, we've been so focused inside Washington in recent years. The campaign basically came about because a lot of policymakers said, we'd kind of like to do something like Simpson Bowles. You know, we'd kind of like to fix this problem. But we're going to get killed in our districts and our states if we do, because the lobbyists who will come out against every one of these changes, the AARP, the Grover Norquist, the labor unions, you know, every group is going to lose something from it. A budget deal is only serious. The big test is it serious? If enough people hate it, you're going to know it's pretty serious. It's real. But that leads to a massive lobbying campaign. And so our objective was to create something that showed there's actually a lot of support in this country for coming together and addressing these problems. And we were sort of stunned at the huge reaction that came out of building this organization. And first, one of the things that a lot of members of Congress said is, where's the business community? They used to be a huge part of this, but back when we were talking about a balanced budget amendment, the business community in many ways led that whole effort. Recently, they've kind of been missing in action. So we went out, and you can find plenty of information about Fix the Debt on our website, but there's many, many CEOs, small businesses, former members of Congress. We have state organizations in 23 states. We built a real outside game. Now the problem with having an outside game right now is there's no inside game on the issue. Nobody actually wants to address this issue. And so what we're trying to do is build a network that will both pressure people to come back, and realistically, it's not going to be until we have the next president. And realistically, in order to make that happen, we're going to have to talk an awful lot during this presidential campaign about the real issues so that we can create a mandate to address it in the next campaign. But the Fix the Debt effort is there so that we can push the candidates and then the future president and policymakers to talk about the issue and lend them support when they're actually willing to step up and do something. So let me go into the policy for a couple minutes and just talk about sort of why the debt even matters. And I think there's probably a pretty widespread understanding of that. But to start, our debt right now is at record levels, right? It's the highest it's been as a share of the economy since we were coming out of World War II. When we entered the huge crisis of 2008, our debt was below 40% of GDP. It was 38% of GDP. And it's now at 74% of GDP. And that has a number of different effects. For all the empirical work on this topic, you can't grow your economy when your debt is at too high a level. And right now, the general consensus is that our debt is high enough. It's hurting our economic recovery, which has been slow for many, many reasons, but I would argue that the debt is part of that. And it's certainly keeping us from having a sustained growth path. And as everybody knows, kind of economic growth is one of the overall objectives here. In order to have a healthy economy, it needs to be growing. That is the only way that you're going to increase jobs, increase wages, increase the standard of living, go back to what used to be a given in this country and no longer is, but the notion that you would leave a stronger economy for the next generation than the one that you inherited. And I think in many ways that's kind of at the core of all of this, that we are really jeopardizing that basic principle about leaving a stronger economy for the next generation. I'll share a kind of embarrassing story, but when I started working in this field quite some time ago, somebody said, oh, we need to interview you for a TV show. And so I thought I was being interviewed. It was a fine interview. And then in the mail came this big photograph of me and all these lines kind of going down, plummeting. And it turns out, you know how you see those dial tests where they look at what the politicians say? So unbeknownst to me, they had been dial testing me. And it came with a very unfriendly letter saying, Dear Maya, we've dial tested you, and it turns out you are highly unlikable. And I just thought, like, that's just mean. What if you send a letter to somebody and tell them that when you hadn't even asked? And they said, your problem is you sit there and you talk about things like actuarial balance. And nobody wants to hear about actuarial balance, which came as a shock to me because I love talking about actuarial balance. And they said, here's our advice. You need to, when you're talking, you need to hold up pictures of your children. And at the time, I didn't even have kids, and they were like, it does not matter. It can be somebody else's kids. Just hold up some photos. So I will not hold up photos of the kids that I now have. But it really does boil down to this. This is a very complicated issue, and it's also a very simple issue. And the complicated part, we can go through kind of all the different policies and things about the trade-offs and healthcare costs and how we're going to fix Social Security and the best ways to reform the tax code and how doing that or not doing that affects the economy. But on the most simple, basic level, we really have a problem in this country. And that problem is that we want to spend a lot of money. We don't spend it on investments. It is okay to borrow in your personal life and as a country and as a state when you're borrowing for the right things. So if we were borrowing to enhance the education system, the basic research, the infrastructure, the worker retraining, so many things that you need to have a thriving economy, there could be a case for borrowing. That's not what we're spending our money on. Last time I looked at these numbers, and granted it was 5 years ago, but it probably hasn't changed too much. 86% of our budget was on consumption, 14% was on investment, right? Nobody should run an enterprise that way. So the bottom line is we want to spend all this money almost exclusively, certainly primarily on consumption, and we don't want to pay for it. That is why we respond well when politicians dangle shiny new spending programs or tax cuts, or those shiny new spending programs never have price tags that come with them. We very, very rarely actually pay for the new things that we're doing. So at the simplest level, it really comes down to we're kind of spending away our children's future. And on the economic level, there's so many effects that this happens, right? So you can't grow your economy nearly as well as you can if you had been running fiscally responsible budgets. And I would argue that doesn't mean balancing the budget every year. There are plenty of times when the economy is slow that having bigger deficits absolutely makes sense. I think it was a key part. I'm not, there are differences about whether the stimulus was effective or not. I would say the stimulus wasn't spent in the right way in a lot of ways, but having some stimulus during the downturn of 2008 was critical to compensate for the lost demand from the huge economic downturn. But when you borrow when the economy's bad, the deal is you're going to save when the economy is good, right? So that you want to basically balance the budget at least over the business cycle. That's not what we're doing. So we're at record levels right now with the debt at 74% of GDP. We are slated to borrow another $7 trillion over the next 10 years. That's before any political promises are put forward. And judging from the past, it's much more likely that what we'll do is start entering into more spending or tax cuts, depending on the makeup of Congress. And frankly, Republicans love spending programs and Democrats love tax cuts too. Sort of generalizing into that basket isn't really the accurate generalization. It really is policymakers like to give away things. They don't like to make hard choices. And part of the problem, well, it comes back to us. We don't reward people for making hard choices. We reward them for giving away things. But for instance, if you were to put in place a deficit plan that would bring the debt just back down on a glide path where right now the debt's growing faster than the economy. If we switched that so that we could get the economy to be growing faster than the debt, the estimates are that over a working lifetime, that would translate to another $250,000 in income for an average worker. This has real effects on households. I would argue that in addition to making the mistake of liking to talk about actuarial balance, those of us who care about this issue have done a very poor job of personalizing it. I understand, and I don't. I understand why people don't, and I don't. People don't go home and fret about the deficit as a kitchen table issue, right? When healthcare costs are growing this fast, when many of us have no very good plan for how we're going to finance our kids' education, when the job situation is shaky, there are real things that people can see every day when infrastructure is crumbling. There's so many concerns that we all have about what the federal government could and should be doing. It is very hard to understand how the deficit and debt affect us personally, but they have a profound effect on every single bit of our economic life and our foreign policy life these days. I mean, Admiral Mullen said that the single biggest threat facing the country is not a security threat, but it's the debt, to your point about ISIS. We hear that regularly. Erskine Bowles used to have a great line about how this country has promised if China ever attacked Taiwan, that we would back up Taiwan, that we are their ally. The only problem, of course, is we have to go to China to borrow the money to do so. It's funny, and yet it's kind of chilling at the same time, right? So we have become very vulnerable in the huge amount of money that we are borrowing, again, not just domestically, but from overseas. So there are many economic reasons. So it slows down the economy. It puts a huge squeeze on our budget. Does anybody know what the fastest growing part of the budget is? Interest? It's interest. Interest payments. That, by the way, again, and you don't want to oversimplify and say, oh, the federal government is just like a family. But in this case, when interest payments are the fastest line item in your budget, you are in trouble. That is a huge warning sign. That is when any financial expert says you've got to get control of the situation. So we have record levels of debt, slated to grow by a record amount going forward. Interest is the fastest growing part of the budget. That means it's squeezing out every other part of the budget. I don't care whether you are the deepest conservative or the deepest liberal. That means that there is less space to do those other kinds of priorities that we should be doing. It's leading to a standard of living that is lower than it otherwise would be. Ultimately, what it also means is when we face the next financial crisis, there was a very good article about this 3 weeks ago, I think, on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. But we're kind of tapped out right now in this country for when we reach the next financial crisis. We usually have two big toolboxes, monetary policy and fiscal policy. And when the economy turns down, you fight about, you kind of finesse your way through what the combination of fiscal policy and Fed policy you're going to use to help combat a recession. The problem is now, both those toolboxes are virtually empty, right? Rates are as low as they can go, and we are about to have a very fascinating couple of months where we see what's going to happen if and when rates go up. And fiscal policy is at the point where it was easy to borrow when we needed to last time because our debt was at such a low level compared to the economy. Very different situation right now. So the Wall Street Journal captured a lot of the warnings we've been hearing from the head of the Fed, the head of the Congressional Budget Office, the head of the IMF, all saying the U.S. is now very vulnerable so that when the next economic crisis comes along, we don't know that we'll be able to respond as we've been able to in the past. And again, it's very hard from a political perspective to urge action on something to avoid a hardening down the future. If you're watching Washington right now, you know the only way we govern is by deadline or crisis. Nothing is getting done in advance of when it needs to. In fact, we are facing a huge gathering fiscal storm in Washington right now that really nobody's paying that much attention to. But we have all of these deadlines, things that should have been addressed before. A highway trust fund that is about to run out of funding. Tax extenders, these are these tax breaks that run out every year and then we put them back in place, usually not paying for them and usually employing a whole lot of tax lobbyists in the process. But tax extenders, that actually ran out so that a lot of businesses don't know what taxes and tax breaks they will have because we're going to reinstate them retroactively. Again, I just feel like we're shooting ourselves in the foot over and over again in terms of trying to fix our economy. You can't ask anybody to run a business when there's no stability. They don't even know what the tax regime is going to be. But we have these tax extenders, the highway trust fund. Our government, isn't looking to be slated to be funded for the next fiscal year, which starts on October 1st. We have the reemergence of the sequester, which was these very low caps that they put on spending. We had a big task force called the super committee. When the super committee failed, the result was we put a sequester in place. That has across-the-board spending caps, but on the part of the budget that's not the problem, which is domestic spending. There were savings to get there, but it's the lowest part of the share of the budget that it's been in decades. Whereas entitlement spending, and it's the programs people love, but Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all sorts of benefits there, are skyrocketing, and we've done nothing to try to reform them. So this sequester is coming back in the beginning of October, and again, there's no plan for how to get rid of it, and a lot of people are talking about let's just lift it and not pay for it, which would add more money to the debt. Finally, the Disability Trust Fund. Social Security is both retirement and disability. The Disability Trust Fund runs out of money next year. There is no plan in Washington to address this. So here we are coming up to these huge, important deadlines that really have profound effects on people's lives. And because nobody's willing to kind of make the hard choices of, okay, how are we going to replenish this fund? How are we going to get savings out of disability? If we need to put more money in there, where is it going to come from? What are the trade-offs, which is what a budget really is, trade-offs? Nobody's willing to tackle these, so we wait until the last minute. So to switch quickly, I think the whole game here is what's going to happen in the presidential election. This is about, are we going to have a real discussion on how you address these issues, and there is no right answer. There are so many ways that we could fix this problem. Again, none of them easy, and I think realistically, all of them are going to require real political compromise. If somebody has a plan to save $4 trillion just from spending cuts or just from tax increases, which is what you'll hear about in the primaries, it's just not going to work. It's not going to happen. It's not going to get done. And neither party, in truth, wants to own all those hard choices. The Republicans now have the Senate and the House. They, again, traditionally have looked for ways to reform entitlements. As soon as they actually have the power to, I'm not going to go into all these things like reconciliation of the budget because my numbers would be dropping, I know. But there are many procedural opportunities to make a lot of cuts in the budget right now. Suddenly all the willpower's disappeared because really neither party can do this without the other party giving them cover. This is we have to hold hands and jump off the cliff together and explain to the American people why having a sound fiscal situation where your debt's not growing faster than your overall economy and interest is not the fastest growing part of the budget is critical for economic growth and their lives. You need both parties to do that. And so what we're really hoping, and Fix-It is working very hard in the states right now, a lot in Iowa, New Hampshire, a lot in South Carolina, Florida, a couple different states, to help facilitate a discussion. Where we say we really need the candidates to talk about what would you put in your first budget? How, when you come into office in February, you have to submit a budget. What would be in that to put the debt so that it's on a downward path? What are the kinds of choices that you would make? If you're going to offer a new plan, how would you pay for it? So I think that's the most important emphasis right now. How do we have a real discussion with candidates and try to get away from, I mean, it's a fun election to watch, I'll grant you that. I can't wait till the next debate to see what happens and what explosive things happen. But if you read the papers every day, you're not hearing very much about policy, right? The primary discussion is on Trump, no Trump, you know, it's all the politics, it's all the sport. But we're really not getting much in the policy discussion. So I think it's critical that we sort of push in that direction, that people, when they're talking to candidates and talking in environments like this, start thinking about how we're going to deal with entitlements, how we're going to control spending, how we're going to raise revenues in a way that doesn't hurt the economy, where those trade-offs are. I've already talked much longer than I meant to, so sorry, let's jump into a discussion. Who has ideas for how we're going to fix this problem? Yeah.
I don't have any ideas, but I'd like to know why isn't the press solidly on your corner?
It's really interesting. The press, particularly editorial boards, have been in our corner before. So 2 years ago, for the past 3 years, after Simpson Bowles, there was so much excitement, and there was a lot of press about, one, why we needed to do this, and two, talking about how to do that. And I will tell you what happened in Washington is we hit a moment, a prolonged moment of fiscal fatigue, where we had, and you'll probably remember all these terms, but not the specifics, we had a fiscal cliff where we didn't fix the problem. We had Boehner and Obama in conversations that were really productive, and I actually saw sort of the final offers between the two of them. They actually had an agreement, which they managed to call a failure. Like if they had just said, like, okay, let's just sign. They had a plan. Twice they had discussions, private and more public. Those didn't amount to anything. They had the super committee. Simpson Bowles never passed because the leadership, we were talking about this earlier, many, many members in the House and Senate were very supportive of Simpson Bowles, but the leadership wasn't. And after, 5 or 6 tries, it just sort of became ridiculous. And so there were so many failures. And I believe what has happened is, first, people don't believe our political system is up to fixing hard problems. I'm not sure I believe our political system is up to fixing hard problems. So the press kind of tired of it. I mean, you all know part of the pressure on the press is they have to find something new to write about and talk about all the time. And the next story of the 7th failed attempt to fix the budget isn't nearly as sexy as, the sports of politics. But the other reason is the federal budget deficit came down. And the difference between the deficit, how much we borrow every year, and the debt, the $18 trillion of accumulated borrowing, can be very confusing. And people are actually eager to have some confusion about that. So you have many politicians right now declaring victory. The deficit's been cut in 2/3. Never mind that it actually grew by 800% before it was cut in 2/3. So that's not that great a claim. Like a deficit of $500 billion is nothing to be throwing a party for. But there's been an excuse to kind of push away from it. And so the press, we work with them a lot. They just say, nobody's interested in this right now. What I've found is nobody in Washington is interested in this right now. Outside of Washington, there's a tremendous interest. We are, running all over the country talking to people, again, trying to get them to talk to candidates. People do get it. They might not get the specifics, but they care about it a lot. But the DC press corps just kind of got tired of lack of success. We're going to need to ramp that up. Yeah.
All right, what about Heritage and some of those advocacy groups? Are they on board with you as well, or?
So we work with all sorts of different think tanks in Washington, and the problem is most of them are on board with us half the time. So when it comes to entitlement reform, there was all sorts of healthcare reforms we went through in the past year that we worked very closely with Heritage about the control of spending. But as soon as we talk about the fact that, listen, this is both sides of the budget, revenues have to be a part of it, Heritage can't go anywhere near that. And then the equivalent, which is CAP, kind of a Democratic think tank, is all over the need for new revenue, but they don't want to talk about doing one penny on entitlements. So I think it's really interesting. I grew up professionally in the think tank world. I actually met my husband working in a think tank. And the think tanks have become more politicized, where they're now more associated with one party or the other. So a lot of them are coming out with ideas that go straight to one party or the other. So we're really eager to work with those who are kind of, again, it's about bipartisanship, not because the ideas of a Heritage or a CAP are wrong, but because they're not going to pass. On some things like new programs, I can see a Republican-only or a Democratic-only priority pass President Obama's health care plan. But when it comes to the hard stuff, you need the think tanks to work together, and they would rather kind of lead on the political side. So we work with them on half of it, but not the whole part generally. There are other budget groups, the Concord Coalition, for instance, that we work really closely with, who share the kind of bipartisan, this is a priority objective. Yeah.
What about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce?
The U.S. Chamber has been very good on this in that they focus a lot on education about why deficits matter and education about the need for entitlement reform. We share many of the same members. About 180 major CEOs are part of Fix the Debt, so we share a lot of members there. That said, the Chamber has a long list of priorities. And when you get down to details, a lot of those priorities will happen to be things that are preserving certain things that actually don't help fix the debt. So this is the trade-off. This is really tough. We have all these great CEOs who are members, and they signed up because they were willing to understand that they were going to have to give up some of their tax breaks, that they wanted to reform the tax code, but the breaks would have to go. But it's just like tax reform. For any of you who have been involved in tax reform, there's a lot of support for it, even broadening the base, which means getting rid of tax breaks, to bring those rates down until you talk about which tax breaks you're getting rid of. Or if you're a family, I mean, I think you can all be familiar with it. We need to clean up the tax code, but boy, does everybody love that home mortgage interest deduction. The only death threat I ever got was when I wrote an op-ed suggesting we reform the home mortgage interest deduction, and that was not a nice flurry of emails from people who don't want to do that. So the Chamber has so many priorities. We do work with them a lot, and we share a lot of their members. But again, they're focused on XM Bank, for instance, right now. That's their #1 priority, and we're a single issue group.
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
When we talk about reforming things, it's not popular. But you know, if you put a tax limit on what people are going to pay when they buy the most expensive cars and the most expensive boats in the world, you may say, look, lady, that doesn't come close to touching anything. But we won't deal with those kinds of issues. And we'll turn around, and I started working when I was 14, I'm 65. I've paid into Social Security all these many years. I've paid for Medicare. I'm still working full time. For the life of me, I can't figure out how that Social Security and Medicare is a, quote, entitlement program. I think getting $300 caps on your Porsches and your Jaguars and your boats, I think that's entitlement. And I think somebody needs to say, wait, time out. Thoughts? Ideas?
Yeah, so again, I think anything to get this done is going to require looking at every single part of the budget. But let me just talk directly about Social Security and Medicare, because these are tough issues because everybody has paid into them. Together, they make up, I mean, Social Security is 1/4 of the budget. Healthcare, Medicare and Medicaid, is more than 1/4 of the budget. There are a lot of ideas about Social Security and Medicare that are not necessarily completely accurate. And one of them is, so far, people have gotten a lot more out of those programs than they've paid in. That's not well understood, and that's not true across the board. But what's happened is we made promises that are larger than the amount of money we paid into the program. So and I should just say, it's only because I'm in South Carolina instead of at home, my father's usually protesting me when I'm talking because he's like, keep your hands off my Social Security. And so years of trying to go through this issue has not convinced him. But we made a mistake by promising more out of Social Security than we were paying to finance. We now have to figure out how to change that program, and I think there's a way we can that's going to protect people who depend on it, protect people who are close to retirement. You can slow the growth of benefits at the high end. You can look at raising the payroll tax cap, where you don't pay all of it all the way up on your income the way you do on Medicare. You can do an accurate calculation for inflation, which is something President Obama put in on his budget. You can talk about the fact that when Social Security started, retirement age was 65, life expectancy was 62. That's not true anymore. And yet we've raised the retirement age by 2 years gradually. We're in the process of moving to 67. But that doesn't reflect those demographic changes. I think there's a lot you could do if you say, let's talk about these changes. We're not going to start them today. We're not going to start them for somebody who's just about to retire. We need to protect the people who planned accordingly. But we can make changes that we phase in gradually in order to make these changes, in order to keep the program able to pay the benefits, and certainly for people who depend on it, able to get the benefits. Healthcare's a little trickier. What we really have to do is figure out how to slow the growth of healthcare costs. That's in Medicare, in Medicaid, and in the overall healthcare system. That's going to take a lot of really wonky changes, both in our delivery system and in our incentives within how we finance it. But I will just say, frankly, I mean, honestly, you can't fix these programs without fixing Social Security and Medicare. Talking about taxing luxury items, which can certainly play a role in it. We can tax hedge funders at the right amount. There's all sorts of things we can do. But in the end, that won't be enough money to fix the problem. But it sure would be important in making people feel like they can trust the government. Because I think one of the problems, and this may be something you're saying as well, is no one feels like they're being treated very fairly. People feel like they're going to be the one group that ends up kind of ponying up and helping fix the problem. And my observations from talking with people is people really are willing to be part of the solution if, one, the fix is big enough to actually fix it, so that we don't have these huge, let's default on the government, let's shut down the government, these horrible, take it not just to the brink, but past the brink. And then even then, we haven't fixed the problem. We keep doing these deals, they don't fix it. So we need a deal that's big enough to fix the problem, and people feel like they're treated fairly. I think people understand they're not going to like everything in a budget deal, but there really is a way to do one where people are treated fairly and people who depend on the programs are protected. But I think it needs to be all in. And we have
Maya, we're honored to have you here today. Thanks for being at Columbia Rotary.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to call on President-elect John Backus to tell us what's coming up next week.
Okay, next week we have General Cloutier, the relatively new commander of Fort Jackson. He's a really interesting fellow, so I hope to bring military friends and others to come here to General next week. I think it'd be a great program.
Looks good. Get a VIP pass on the way out if you didn't get one, and please stand. We're going to recite the four-way test, and then we'll sing. So, four-way test right here. Of the things we think, say, and do. Is it true?
Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?